Voices of OPMD is a podcast series sharing real stories and bold science from the world of oculopharyngeal muscular dystrophy, OPMD, a rare genetic muscle disorder that often goes undiagnosed and misunderstood. In this podcast, we explore lived experience, medical insight, and the growing movement of advocacy and research behind this condition. This series is about connection between patients and caregivers, families and clinicians, individuals and community. Because when we speak our truths, we create space for others to do the same. Today, I'm honored to be joined by Dr. Sharon Hesterlee, President and CEO of the Muscular Dystrophy Association, a leader whose work spans decades across academia, biotech, and nonprofit research. Sharon has been at the forefront of advancing neuromuscular science and patient-centered care, and her perspective on the adult-onset community is both essential and inspiring. In this conversation, we discuss the unique challenges facing adults with neuromuscular diseases, the opportunities on the horizon, and how collaboration across research, care, advocacy, and creative partnerships can build the momentum we need. So let's dive in. First of all, Dr. Hesterlee, thank you for joining me today.
No, thank you for having me.
I would love you to provide a high-level overview of adult-onset muscular diseases, like what they are, how they differ from childhood onset, and any unique challenges that you see.
Yeah, sure. So adult-onset diseases really many times are part of a spectrum where there are occasionally more severely affected individuals who have early infancy or childhood onset, but then the majority of cases tend to be later onset. And they're sort of referred to as milder cases, but as we know, that's, they're not really mild. They just start later in time. So that being said, one of the primary differences, I think, between diseases, neuromuscular diseases that primarily start in childhood and diseases that start in adulthood, is that the ones that start in adulthood tend to progress more slowly. And that it becomes a challenge that we will probably talk about later when we talk about therapy development and being able to understand the progression of the disease. That's not always the case. There are some adult onset neuromuscular diseases like ALS or Lou Gehrig's disease that have a fairly rapid course. But for the most part, they tend to progress more slowly.
Thank you for that. So from the perspective of the Muscular Dystrophy Association, how big is this category and what gaps do you currently see in diagnosis, care, and research across the landscape?
Yeah, so I think people would be surprised to know that this is a very large category. There are actually more adults affected by neuromuscular disease than children. Sometimes because children grow up and become adults with the diseases, but there are more adult onset diseases in this space. So MDA covers over 300 different neuromuscular diseases. And I would say probably upwards of 60 or 70% are actually adult onset diseases. They're just lesser known than the more severe childhood forms that people hear about.
I had no idea when I was asking you that question that there were 300. That's a big landscape to actually deal with. And so if you look at the gaps in that landscape, where are they? Do you see that they're in diagnosis, that they're in, patients getting care? Are they in research, or are they across all of those?
Yeah, different spaces. So it's not a monolithic category by any means. Certainly diagnosis in some disease areas is a big deal. So limb-girdle muscular dystrophy, for example, affects primarily adults. And there are probably 40 to 60% of people who look clinically like they have limb-girdle don't have a genetic diagnosis. So diagnosis can be a very big deal for that group. And also Charcot-Marie-Tooth disease, which is a peripheral neuropathy, has hundreds of genes associated, and many people who seem to have CMT don't have a diagnosis. So in those cases, that would be a large gap, but in many cases, it's the need for effective therapies. And there, again, the biggest roadblock is because most of these diseases progress more slowly than the childhood forms. It just means that it takes a very long time to develop drugs and test them And often many are very rare on top of that. So the combination of those two things makes it more difficult to do therapy development. And so having effective therapies is clearly a gap.
Yeah, we see that in the world of OPMD as well, although we are very fortunate to have, some forwarding some research into therapies with Benetech Biopharma and other research that's being done. That's kind of excellent news. And I think the research being done in any category seems to, kind of be able to have other researchers look at it and say, well, maybe that'll make a difference in our disease. So I think the coming together is really important. What do you think about that?
Oh, that's definitely true. I mean, you can see that, you brought up the Benetech work, for example, where they're, using a molecule to block the expression of the mutated OPMD gene product. But they're having to do that with a gene therapy vector. So this is a modified virus that can deliver, these blocking materials. And gene therapy is a category that MDA has been funding now for, over 20 years. And we put about $125 million into it. And a lot of it is about how you deliver things with these modified viruses. So getting things into muscle is relevant across all of the disease and muscle diseases. So work that, we've put into developing gene therapy for many other muscle diseases will benefit OPMD in that way.
Okay, great. So 20 years, that's kind of a lot of history in funding this. And, it's these therapies, that was like in the nascent years of those therapies as well. So can you just briefly describe the trajectory of progress in more recent years for adult onset diseases, and maybe also how research into the pediatric neuromuscular diseases is also impacting progress as well?
Yeah, of course. So, in the last 10 years or so, there have been almost 30 new drugs approved for neuromuscular diseases, many of them for childhood forms. And those sort of paved the way, sometimes from a technical standpoint, but often from a regulatory standpoint, which is equally important, that there is a path that companies and investors can see to getting a drug approved. They've got an example of a drug that's approved maybe in a childhood form of the disease, and they know what was acceptable to the FDA to get that drug approved. And that gives them the confidence to then start exploring the adult onset diseases, which, as I mentioned, can be harder because, you have to do longer trials if you have a slower disease course. But that's been happening. So we've had many diseases approved for Duchenne muscular dystrophy and spinal muscular atrophy, both of which have adult forms, but the drugs that were approved started in the early childhood forms. So now what we're seeing is companies really investing in the adult onset diseases. So right now that looks primarily like limb-girdle muscular dystrophy, myotonic dystrophy, facioscapulohumeral muscular dystrophy, and CMT, the peripheral neuropathy I mentioned earlier. And we're starting to see companies like Benetech invest in OPMD as well. So they got the confidence they needed from seeing successes in these childhood forms of the diseases to be able to do this, both from a technical and a regulatory standpoint.
I think that is really important information for, not only our audience, and hopefully this will reach more than just the OPMD audience, because I don't think people really understand what it takes to actually get a drug to market, and that, what has benefited another patient population really can indeed benefit your population, but it does take time. And it does take time because the disease, even though it might not feel like it to you, does progress more slowly in the adult onset diseases. Fabulous. Thank you for that information. Could you walk us through how the Muscular Dystrophy Association is structured for supporting the diseases? So you just went into it a little bit. You've for 20 years you've been funding it. That's really great. There's strategies that you have, I know, around research funding, care centers, data strategy, and I just want people to be familiar with how that works from the muscular dystrophy perspective.
Sure. So this is basically On the research side, sort of a three-legged stool, if that makes sense. We fund research grants, much like the NIH funds research grants. So investigators will send us proposals and they get reviewed by a committee. So the only requirement is the proposal has to be related to neuromuscular disease. So we have pretty high levels. So we get proposals on all 300 of the diseases that we cover, obviously with concentrations in some of those that are more common of the 300. They get reviewed by expert panel, and then they get scored, and then we draw a cutoff line. And so what comes above the line gets funded, what comes below the line usually does not. And so we don't have a preconceived bucket of how much we're going to fund in each disease area. It really depends on the grants that we receive. So that's our main research funding mechanism. We have funded over $1 billion since the 1950s when we were founded in neuromuscular disease research. A lot of that has been finding new genes or investing in technologies, platform technologies like gene therapy or cell-based therapies. But then the other part of that three-legged stool, we also have a network of 150 care centers across the U.S. where people can go and be seen and have sort of multidisciplinary care. So hopefully you don't have to schedule multiple visits to see a pulmonologist or, to see a physical therapist, that you can see all of those specialists at one place and be seen by someone who knows and understands these relatively rare neuromuscular diseases. So many of these sites also participate in research. I don't have a figure off the top of my head, but it's well over half of these sites are actually also clinical trial sites. So that's another important aspect of what we do. And then finally, data is important to us too. We collect clinical data through our neuromuscular disease database, MOVER, which originally was focused on 7 neuromuscular diseases, but we are sort of reimagining that platform and expanding it so that we will be able to incorporate many other different diagnoses going forward. And in that case, people would consent with us directly, and then we would have access, and by our research team and our collaborators would have access to the medical records to be able to pull that data. We will be able to share that data back with the person who consents. So and also if the person consents to share it with their physician, we'll be able to share it that way as well, with very tight controls over who has access to the data, obviously. But that data is really helpful, in particular, understanding the progression of these diseases. So especially something like OPMD, which is, it's all of these diseases are rare, but OPMD is a less common rare disease. To be able to do a natural history study is a lot of work and time. But if we can also augment that with people's, medical records, we can get some of that data about progression from the medical records as well. So that's sort of an important aspect of what we do. So those are sort of the 3 ways that we fund research. And of that, like I said, we don't have specific buckets, but, over the years, we have funded probably about 50 projects focused just on OPMD. And that's about $8 million worth of research.
Very exciting. Is the data that you collect international, or is it only U.S. based?
The clinical data is U.S. based. We collaborate with some other groups in the space. There's an organization called TreatMD that collects more international data. The rules and requirements for collecting data are just very different, especially in Europe, where the privacy requirements are really high. Mm-hmm. That so far our clinical data efforts have been concentrated in the U.S., but we actually fund research worldwide.
I imagine the information coming from around the world is really helpful, but any data is really good to really inform the way forward. So thank you for everyone who has consented to share their data. It really does make a difference. So can you speak to any particular programs or partnerships that you currently have addressing adult onset conditions? Just a bright light, or, anything in particular that you see like, wow, this is going to be high value for the neuromuscular disease community.
Yeah. So one of the things, the themes we keep coming back to is the fact that we need to understand how these diseases progress, which means you have to study them over a long period of time to understand the natural history or the progression. That's important because if you want to understand if a drug or intervention works, you need to you need to be able to show that you're slowing or stopping progression of the disease. If someone actually gets better, that's usually much easier to see. But we also want to be able to detect the ability to slow or stop progression. So one of the things that we've funded in multiple cases, we've funded these large clinical networks to do natural history studies. So we've done that. We've funded networks in limb-girdle muscular dystrophy and myotonic and FSH dystrophy. And we've also funded a similar network in CMT, Charcot-Marie-Tooth disease. These are all adult onset neuromuscular diseases where you really need to study that natural history over many years to really appreciate, what that looks like, and try to find what are those things that you can measure that might predict that you're going to have an impact with a drug or an intervention. And because these are big long-term studies, we're typically co-funding. So NIH is also funding, and also many other single disease organizations in these spaces have also pitched in funding for these disease areas.
So it's exciting that there is kind of a lot of research, and you're studying people for a really long time that will make a difference, not only in the drug development, but really understanding the progression of disease in people, because people just crave more information about what could this look like for me. I know it's not typical the way that people, the disease shows up in people, but people crave that information about what could this really look like for me? So that's just as important. So you've mentioned gene therapy. You've mentioned data. Are there any other big opportunities that you see that aren't really fully tapped in this research space?
Yeah. So, as we work on our strategic directions going forward, so we just had our 75th anniversary. So it was a great time to kind of look back on what we've accomplished, but it's also a good time to retool and say, where are we going in the future? And one of the things that we felt like was a gap in the muscle disease space in particular is muscle regeneration. So unlike the nervous system, we know that muscles do regenerate. You can build muscle. That capability is just inhibited in various ways and in disease contexts. So one of our focuses has been, how do we really develop ways to rebuild muscle that would impact, any muscle disease? And it's understanding the biology. How do muscles naturally heal themselves from damage? How do muscles grow over your lifetime? From the time you're a child, as you get older, your muscle grows. If you work out and exercise, you break down muscle and it rebuilds. So understanding how those natural processes work, and then understanding how they work, with a disease background. Can we modify that to rebuild muscle? Because some of the things that we're doing, blocking genes or putting genes back, they're great, but you can only do that in muscle that actually exists. So as a two-pronged approach, we need to first rebuild muscle and then stabilize that muscle. Mm-hmm. So that's been a new area that we're really looking forward to investing more resources into.
Oh, that's like super, super exciting. I'm going to tell you honestly, I go through that query every day as someone, I don't necessarily know which of my muscles are impacted besides my eyes and my throat, right? I do know that I have some impact in my muscles, but I'm like, I just turned 60 this year. Is it age, or is it actually my OPMD? And I do still go. I went and, did strength training at the gym this morning. I do other things in the hopes of not losing the muscle that I do have, which is good for every adult. But it's really good that, this is an area that's really being looked at, and whether it's safe to exercise. People ask those questions all the time. I don't know that the answers, but people are looking into it. And I think that's like an exciting area to hear that there is research in those areas.
Yeah. I would say, ironically, what's interesting is there's been a resurgence of interest in preserving muscle and growing muscle because of the popularity of the GLP-1s, the weight loss drugs, because people lose weight, but they tend to lose a lot of muscle mass. And so, although the neuromuscular diseases are rare, people wanting to lose weight, it's not a rare situation. So companies are starting to reinvest heavily in understanding how to grow and preserve muscle. And ironically, the GLP-1s may ultimately end up benefiting those, populations with rare muscle diseases.
Yeah, but really interesting. So lots of momentum that I hear. What do you see creating the most momentum in this space right now?
Yeah, well, I think it's the pull of the drugs that have been approved. Because we've had so many drugs approved in the last 10 or 15 years or so, we sort of hit critical mass of understanding. That's sort of created, again, this pathway that shows that it can be done. And so we do see more companies in this space, and that's always helpful. So to make a drug, it's almost, it's I won't say never, but it's very rare that a drug is designed start to finish at a university, for example. Usually at some point, this technology gets transferred to a company who does see some profit in developing a drug, and they're able to do that. So seeing more companies in this space is really encouraging. I think that's, the important endpoint of being able to get these drugs actually out to market and available to people.
Okay. And then the opposite end of the spectrum, where do you see that there are bottlenecks that need to be freed up?
Yeah, so I think for rare disease in particular, the biggest bottleneck, especially for anything that affects, say, under 1,000 people, under 4,000 people, there are these different gaps. Then you have a small market. So like I said, these companies are in the space to make money, and the cost of drug development isn't that scalable. So developing a drug for millions of people is, not a lot different from developing a drug for 100 people. And that becomes a problem when you have a small market. So I think there are things that have been put in place, like the Orphan Drug Act, which really encourages companies and provides some incentives to do this. But we need more and stronger incentives to be able to develop drugs for especially ultra rare diseases that may affect, 100 people. Like I said, there's not a reason for companies to get in this space. But when you add all these diseases up, it actually affects a lot of people. So we need to figure that out. So I think that's a big issue, sort of beyond even some of the challenges with, later onset and slower development. And you brought up a very good point earlier, which is as you age, you lose muscle mass too. So in all the older adult onset diseases, you also have to layer in, aging on top of that. So I think those are sort of big areas: aging, lack of resources for rare and ultra rare diseases that are big bottlenecks still.
Yeah, got it. So is there anything that an association like the OPMD Association or other associations can do to impact those bottlenecks? There may not be, but it would be interesting.
Oh, I think so. From a regulatory standpoint, the requirements for developing a drug are very stringent, and it's really hard to scale them for rare diseases. And so, we are pretty active in the advocacy space around FDA, around new legislation that might help promote rare disease drug development. And so we need all hands on deck for that. So, all organizations, we want to reach out and partner with everyone. If there's an opportunity to weigh in on legislation that's going to speed this process up, I think that that's a great way that everyone can participate. Other than that, continuing to help fund or co-fund, banding together to fund some of these longer-term research projects is another good way to support research in these areas.
Okay. And when you say banding together, it's basically sharing information, like adult onset advocacy organizations sharing information with each other is just as important, and maybe coming to the MDA with a grant together, in looking
For example, yeah.
And
we're very open to that. So we co-fund projects with a lot of organizations. And then actually in our conference, so we have an annual conference in the spring that's a professional conference, but we invite other organizations to participate and provide booth space so they can be there, reach out to the clinicians and the companies in the space. Mm-hmm. So it's providing those forums for groups to interact.
Yeah, and we were there a couple of years ago, which is how we got connected with Benetech and, some other organizations. So it does work, definitely.
Great.
And how about, just having, storytelling, awareness initiatives? Do you think that, just getting that information out there, like, especially when you're competing with, ALS, which is much more out there. Or when I say I have muscular dystrophy, people say, "Oh, you have MS."
I,
Like, you know, what's the importance of really just driving awareness and telling the stories as a patient group?
Yeah, so I think that's huge. I think storytelling is a really compelling way to get a message out there. And there's so many venues for doing that now, even as an individual, if you're just sitting at home thinking what you can do. There's social media forums, TikTok, all of which isn't just kids dancing, believe it or not. There's a very good representation of rare disease on TikTok. Telling your story in a compelling way, explaining what the disease is. I think the more we can do that, the more it opens people's eyes to the fact that there are all these different diseases that, could benefit from more research, from more attention, and we can get the word out that way. So I think there's a lot of avenues to do that now. And of course, at MDA, we continue to try to do that as to the extent that we can.
If there was a sweet spot collaboration right now in the adult onset space, like if you could just greenfield this, what might it look like?
Yeah, so I think collaborating around data collection is a sweet spot. A lot of organizations have registries, even if it's just a mailing list or database. If we can start putting some of that data together, of course, in a way that protects people's privacy and their wishes, I think that's really helpful because in rare disease, every piece of data that you can put together is useful, especially international collaboration. So you had asked earlier about whether, we collect data internationally. We don't, but we know organizations that do. So putting those sources together is really helpful. I think those are great ways that people can continue to collaborate, and also around the advocacy questions, really good, easy ways for people to collaborate and have a big impact potentially.
Okay, great. Thank you. So just really being in action and really kind of thinking about how getting our information out there will really make an impact. If not right now, it will help build the impact for the research that's being done or potential future research. So it's all very important. Can you share any success stories with me? Things that have been really done well, like where momentum was really built, like research moved forward and patient outcomes changed. And it doesn't have to be an adult onset example. It could be, but I think it's just really helpful for people to understand how what this might look like in a best case scenario.
Yeah, so I can give an example. There's a disease called Friedreich's ataxia, which is actually sort of a late teenage onset disease. It's a neuromuscular disease that causes, lack of motor, it causes muscle weakness, but also lack of motor control, some, issues with ataxia and balance. So this disease probably affects about 4,000 people in the United States. And years ago, MDA was collaborating with FARA, the Friedreich's Ataxia Research Alliance, to collect the natural history data that we lacked. So they put a very robust natural history study in place that's been running for almost 15 years now. It has continued to evolve and collect more data. It's primarily funded by FARA at this point. But that really built a strong foundation to get companies motivated and interested in that disease area. And so recently there was a drug approved by Biogen for Friedreich's ataxia. And after you have one drug approved, again, that research, that regulatory pathway is there, and companies see that this can be done. So it's really opened up the floodgates for interest in that disease. And so that's a nice sort of example of how that can happen. And that is in the process of happening with some other adult onset neuromuscular diseases where we just don't have drugs approved yet, but they're in process, sort of through that same path.
Okay, awesome. So really great to hear. So, you definitely have lessons learned, and you can share that with any kind of organization to kind of say, this works. This is the type of model that you want to follow. And I think it's really helpful to know, we've been taking that kind of feedback from the Muscular Dystrophy Organization in our approach, for OPMD, and really are diving into, data through a patient registry, and then the natural history studies, and then, of course, the research that's being done, which is super exciting. So We hope to be one of your success stories very soon.
Yeah, all that stuff pays off. I think it's absolutely the right thing to be doing.
Yeah. Just wrapping this up, if you could share maybe a couple of things that you hope to see in the next 2 or so years. I know that you probably plan so much further out than that. What are the things that you really kind of hope to see as progress or as successes in that amount of time?
Yeah, so over the next couple of years, I mean, we'd love to see things move forward in the muscle regeneration category, whether that's stem cells or some other mechanism, to get something that's actually moved into the clinic or potentially paired with something else, like a gene therapy, where you're either blocking or putting a gene back and you pair that with something that builds muscle at the same time. That would be very exciting. We're also looking at some new platforms. So gene therapy right now primarily uses these modified viruses that work, but have some challenges because viruses stimulate the immune system. So we're looking at non-viral platforms. So investing sort of early in ways to deliver things to muscle that don't require viruses. Something that where you can redose. So something people may not realize is that when you give someone a gene therapy, you basically immunize them against that viral delivery mechanism. So you can only treat people one time. Sometimes you might need to retreat, or the dose was too low, or people grow and their muscles get bigger and you need to treat again. So looking at non-viral platforms is something where you could redose and not have these immune responses. That's really exciting to us. And that's something that we want to see developed, to really start to invest in. It will probably take more than a couple of years, but we're in it for the long haul. So, we like to get in and invest early, getting these things to going.
Well, yep. So you have that history, right? So you know that building the momentum is really important, and it would be really very exciting to see a lot more momentum in the muscular regeneration space in that amount of time, even if it's not, this is de facto like what we know, but really kind of seeing how important this area is.
Yeah, and seeing more drugs approved too. We're starting, we have some late phase trials going on now in myotonic dystrophy, in FSHD, and limb-girdle muscular dystrophy. So we're going to start to have these adult onset drugs approved probably in the next 2 or 3 years.
Very exciting. So specifically for, our audience, which is OPMD, but I hope other people tune in, what would be the kind of one thing that you would encourage patients or their caregivers, if they're kind of the most active, to do or think about after this podcast to help build momentum?
Yeah, so I think there are a couple of things that you can do. Obviously, we talked about storytelling. If people are willing to tell their stories and to talk about the disease, I think that actually really helps promote interest in understanding out in the public. Advocacy efforts, feel free to check out the advocacy pages at MDA. These are all efforts that are aimed at the full neuromuscular community. Certainly check in with the OPMD organization as well for those kinds of initiatives. Those are huge things you can do. And if there is a possibility to participate in a clinical trial, I suggest exploring that. It's not right for everyone. There's a lot of sacrifice that comes along with clinical trials and some risk. But if that's something that you're interested in doing, that can be a huge help to the research process.
Yeah. I mean, I wish that I could do the clinical trial. I actually had throat surgeries, so I couldn't do it. Or, surgery on my, a myotomy. So I couldn't participate, but I'm really thankful for the people in our community who are doing that, or anyone who is participating in research. So you mentioned, people going to the advocacy pages on MDA. Is there any way that you don't want people to interact with the MDA, or you just encourage all interaction and you want to hear from everyone, or do you want to hear only in a specific way?
Oh, I don't think we have any there's not a specific way. However people want to interact with us, we are happy to meet them in whatever space that is. And that means, share with us your experiences, good or bad. At MDA, we want to hear about all of it, because if you go to a care center, for example, and don't have a great experience, we definitely want to know about that. We hope you have a good experience, but it's harder for us to address things if we don't know about them. So we encourage all communication.
Okay, great. And is there anything that you'd like to say in closing that we haven't covered?
No, I think it's a really exciting time. I think there is a lot of momentum. I think that's the right word. And we're really starting to see this focus now, this shift, not a shift, but an expansion of focus from the childhood forms of muscular dystrophy to those adult forms. I mean, it's really happening now. So it's a very exciting time.
Yeah, it is very exciting. So I just want to thank you for your time. And, really appreciate as you're stepping into this new role, which is really big, you taking time to just address our community and, the community at large. I think it really does make a difference for people to understand what's going on out there in the neuromuscular disease landscape. So thank you to Dr. Sharon Hesterlee for being with me today. And thank you, everyone, for listening to this episode of OPMD Voices. If you found today's conversation meaningful, please share it, follow the show, and join us in creating momentum for this community and for others. Until next time, I'm Maureen Costello, and this is OPMD Voices. This podcast is brought to you by Benetech Biopharma, Inc. Benetech, a clinical stage biotechnology company focused on the advancement of novel genetic medicines with headquarters in Hayward, California, and the OPMD Association. Visit opmd.org for resources, support, and more stories from our community.